How's it going, Jace?
Pretty good, Joe. How about yourself?
Hanging in there.
Yeah.
Busy. Oh, let me get my cool toy. I'll be right back.
Oh, all right.
Show you something cool. Oh, here it is. Right, this is one of them. This is my wooden Kubernetes Slinky. All right.
What?
So, wait. Let me switch cameras here. What's going on? Why am I on the wrong camera? So we gotta look up my nose. There we go. Okay. So I did this on my laser cutter.
Wait a minute. I need to. Whoa, dude.
It's made out of wood. And so when you look at it, it's like one piece of wood, but like this 1/8 plywood is thin enough that if you cut it thin, it's like a Slinky almost. Isn't that crazy?
That's super crazy.
And of course, I made it a septagon because, you know.
Of course.
How we roll.
I'm going to call you the high septon. All right, the time is 11:30. We're going to give people a couple minutes to show up. If you are so inclined, add anything to the agenda. I'd also request that you add your name to the attending list, just so we know who is here. The cat's out of the bag. We're already recording, so FYI, anything you say, including Slinky demonstrations, will be available on the internet till the end of time. All right, everybody. It looks like we are at a good time to start here. Let me check and see who all is in attendance. Make sure you've got quorum. We're a little light on folks today. This is probably going to be the way it goes until we get into the holidays, I'm imagining. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the agenda. So right now we have a KubeCon breakout session scheduled, and right now we don't have an idea about exactly what we want to accomplish during that time. This is a critical time for us to get together with stakeholders firsthand and have discussions or get some of our key takeaways across to people and also get feedback. So what I would like to know is, does anybody have any specific things that they would like to propose for that time? And if so, what are those?
Go ahead, Justin. Sorry.
Oh, well, I was just, this might be a good way to jump off, which I just like, I'm more of like a passive observer of SIG architecture. And I guess like what I would observe passively is that it doesn't seem to be talking about architecture or as in technical architecture, but seems to be talking more about project architecture, like, you know, who moves the pieces of paper from A to B. And I think that an understanding of what SIG architecture is trying to achieve would certainly help me.
So I definitely think that the SIG is not hitting its stride yet. Just sort of, I think that's another take on that. What, in my mind, sort of the precursor to us really getting where we want to go is going to be having sort of a pipeline of proposals that we're evaluating with live meetings discussing those. Because that's when I think there'll be sort of real decisions at stake. And that's when I think people will be sort of more invested in actually what's going on that stuff. So for me, the quickest way to get to the point where we actually view this as being productive, looking at sort of architectural issues, is we got to get our process house in order, right? And I think a lot of that comes around that CAP process, which you know, I'm as guilty as I think everybody is, as you know, other things have come up and it's become, you know, getting that process fine-tuned and really, you know, evangelizing that is not something that we've done yet. We've started on it, but it's kind of, you know, it's been fits and starts. So between now and then and at KubeCon, until we have that CAP process sort of figured out and a couple of beta testers running through the process, I think we're going to have a hard time focusing discussions.
So in light of that observation, Joe, what would you think would be a good use at the KubeCon? I mean, my feeling is that's a great time to radiate information about what the CAP is, what we're trying to accomplish via that, and how it ties into the big picture, you know, to get some additional buy-in, because frankly, a lot of people are confused about it and don't really know that it's actually happening. Yeah.
So the first thing is that I mean, so I'm looking at so this time slot is Thursday. It's at the same time slot where I'm giving my talk, so I'm not going to be able to actually attend it. And like, you know, it overlaps with a bunch of other stuff. So this is the SIG architecture deep dive that Brian's doing, right?
Yeah.
I think it's going to be difficult. Like, first of all, I don't know what the hell Brian's going to say there, because it's not like we have anything decided. But I'm sure he'll have stuff to talk about. I think there's a difference between like, what do we want to say there versus what do we want to get done in time for that? I mean, that's not going to be a working session. That's not going to be a discussion thing, most likely. I'm assuming it's 45 minutes probably of Brian talking at an audience.
Well, I mean, so this is a SIG time slot, and a deep dive can mean a lot of different things for everybody here in the SIG. And I don't think necessarily that Brian is the grand poobah of that time slot if that's not what the SIG necessarily needs to accomplish. I think he's open to getting some input on what is the best thing to do there. So I don't necessarily think that's the best assumption. If there's something you feel passionate that we should try and aim for to have ratified or cleared up or in flight before then, I think that we should try that. I think that would be helpful.
So I think it might be useful for us to set ourselves a goal in time for KubeCon to actually have the CAP process down to the point where we can look at it, we can dry lab it in our brains, and we're like, okay, this is sane. Okay. I'd like to also in that time identify a couple of things that we want to sort of shepherd through this in terms of a beta test. And I think part of that process is determining like one of the things I think we were talking about with the KEP process is having, human sort of shepherds, I don't know what we call them, sort of assigned to this to actually help these KEPs through instead of sort of a random scattershot type of thing, right? If we actually start getting some of that process in place, then by the time we get to KubeCon, we can have some beta testing of this stuff going on. I think having a working session during the contributor summit might make sense, where we really take a bunch of feedback of like what's working, what's not working around this. And then having the SIG architecture deep dive be more focused on what is, essentially getting people used to the idea that, hey, we want to do this KEP process. I honestly, like, Brian's not here, so I can't ask him about that stuff. I don't know what he has planned for that thing. What I don't think is appropriate is for Brian to actually talk for 45 minutes about what he thinks the architecture is when this group hasn't sort of decided it and we haven't actually come to sort of group understanding on that. I think that we have to move past sort of unilateral decisions on what the architecture is, and we have to move to something where there's a sort of scaled out understanding of what's going on.
So I'm going to jump in real quick here. With the community meeting, I saw we've got something in here later. One of the things that I was approached side channel, because I'd created those diagrams based on our conversations, just trying to put to pictures what I think Brian and folks were saying. And there are folks who'd like to have that stuff discussed in the community meeting. And I'll let other folks decide when it's ready and whatnot. But actually communicating and having discussions on architecture where you've got a whole bunch of people in that room, even going beyond that, might be a use of time for that slot. So people can ask questions, try and understand intent, because this is SIG architecture. And if we've got something that can display that diagram-wise that we as a group are happy on, that might be a useful time for that slot. I don't know, just spitballing.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things, and I think those diagrams, and thank you for doing that, Matt, I think those are super useful, but to a certain degree, the map is not the territory, right? So these diagrams are a good way to help orient people. I think we need to be careful that we don't view those diagrams as a straitjacket in terms of like they are an approximation of what we want the architecture and the project to be. They aren't a definition of what the project and the architecture.
Oh yeah, and I think we need better diagrams based on
I'm not saying
feedback.
you meant it that way. I just think as we present this to folks, we got to be careful that like these are some ways to view it. And I think that a lot of times it's very tempting to sort of view these things in a very rigid sort of categorization type of thing. And I'm just not convinced that categorization always holds up to sort of the harsh light of reality.
Yeah, and the only reason that I'm suggesting even putting this stuff out there or coming up with something to put out there is that it's being requested. And right now, I think a lot of folks see Kubernetes as this giant spaghetti monster they can't get their mind around. And when we can put it into a picture, it'll help people who aren't part of this group, who aren't part of the core of it, have a better understanding of what's going on. And that's useful to a lot of the contributors and people who've got to get into Kubernetes.
Yeah,
and
I
so
agree.
That's the only reason I think of it.
I think one really important clarification about that, though, is we're in the state of having something out there. I mean, we can take pictures, of what exists right now, but that's actually not going to net us that much value in terms of architecturally speaking. What we really need to do is focus on the migration, transition, movement forward of these components that we already know, and also developing a model around that. So that's tricky.
Yeah, anytime we have these discussions, and I think a lot of times they get rat-holed in terms of some of the mechanical things that we're talking about, like how are we going to break up the repos? How are we going to manage the community as it grows? Separated from the true architecture issues of like how are we going to actually have the components in the system relating to each other? What is sort of the patterns that we want to actually encourage people to use as they build out new features? How do we actually grow the ecosystem? How do we build an architecture that enables a growing ecosystem in a decoupled way? So those things are, I think, separable from the mechanics of how do we actually break all this stuff out. And I think so many times when we have those discussions, that stuff gets all muddled together.
Yeah, I totally agree, Joe. And the other problem that I've seen happening is that because we haven't clearly enunciated what exactly we're trying to achieve with the architecture, like in some level of detail, we end up with sort of subjective opinions about the architecture should be this, and this should be in, and this should be out, and whatever. But they don't seem to persist very long because there's no well-stated goal for these things. Whereas if we said what we're trying to do is enable a minimalist Kubernetes installation with, arbitrary extensions via, what's the right word? Approved and endorsed additions, as well as unapproved, unendorsed additions via the following mechanisms. Here are some examples. I think that would go a long way. And then we can say, right, now to achieve that, the architecture has to be ABC, as opposed to individual A thinks this is a pretty architecture and individual B thinks this other thing is a pretty architecture.
So I like this. In fact, this is not the first time I've heard the goals thing come up. Is that something that this group should do, is come up with what are the list of goals and kind of agree to that?
I think that's fundamental to what every SIG should be doing, but I totally agree with, if we lead the way by example, I think that would be a good thing, because then we could bound the scope of conversation pieces in the future too as well. Like that's outside of our purview, that's inside our purview type of thing.
Well, not to be too meta here, but it seems like we need a proposal around, we need people to be bringing proposals to SIG architecture as much as any other. So, because the problem is, at the end of the day, what gets done is what gets done. And right now there's nobody doing anything. And I think Brian is trying to do as much as he can in the background. And I give him major props for that, because he's probably one of the busiest people I know, and he's still cranking out stuff. So we need to, I think if there's competing ideas or things that you want to see happen, I think we just need to step up and do it. I mean, bottom line is deliverables are king right now. And I think that we need to just, either we need to do it during this meeting and hack on getting stuff done and not just bite shedding, or we need to have people actually spending time in the background and doing things and presenting to this group and saying yay or nay. And also this group presenting, I think, being really positive and not just like tearing things apart over nits. Like we need to get past nits, or we're never going to get anywhere.
So I think there's dual missions for this group, and this is importing some of the discussions that we've been having in the steering committee. I think that there is upon this group, there's this idea that we want to have the definition of what's inside of Kubernetes, what's outside of Kubernetes, and sort of like what is the boundary around what we're doing and why, what is the well-reasoned way around that. And I think that goes beyond a diagram to sort of like building a shared understanding of like, well, this is what's appropriate to be in Kubernetes and this is the stuff that's not appropriate, and maybe defining different levels of that. So and that's not architecture, that's in some ways product, right? But I think these things become sort of conjoined in a pretty fundamental way. The way that we build the thing defines what it can do and what it can do, so there's definitely a symbiosis there. The second thing I think we need to do is we need to actually, be the body that goes through sort of the coordination, communication, and sort of lubricating the process of making and communicating changes, or decisions and changes that actually affect a wide part of the project.
But Joe, just to go back to your point about what the boundaries of the system are, etc., that is precisely the discussion that seems to go round and round in circles every time I witness it. And my observation is the reason it does is because it's not entirely clear what the goals of setting that boundary are. So if we said, goals are A, B, and C, and therefore those determine that boundary is X, Y, Z, that's a way of making forward progress. But if you just have a bunch of people sitting around saying, I think the boundary should be here, and somebody else saying, the boundary should be here, the conversation goes round and round in circles. So my question to you is very direct. Do you think that the right starting point is to decide what the goals are, and therefore those determine where the boundaries are? Or it sounds like the boundary discussion sort of went ahead without explicitly stating what the goals of the boundary are.
Yeah. So I think there's a certain amount of I'll know it when I see it going on here for sure. I'm not sure that we can get away from that, because there's sort of any definition of goals is going to immediately be sort of mapped in people's minds to, okay, that means X, Y, and Z, and so therefore I'm for or against it. I think that we need to make forward progress there. Brian has a document that is, what is Kubernetes? That he points everybody at for this stuff. This is useful in some ways. I think this is the one that it hasn't been, number one is I don't think it's been vetted by everybody, and I don't think it's been tested in terms of being able to make decisions about what's in and out. I think it might be worthwhile, for us to, as a group, form a set of people who are going to actually go through and write a document saying this is what we think the boundary should be. We can discuss it and tune that. I don't think we're going to hit perfect agreement, but I think we can probably part of the problem is that none of the SIGs have a formal decision-making process, right? There's no idea of who's in, who's out, who gets to approve stuff, who gets to veto. That's one of the things that we're struggling with right now. That's one of the problems that we can take on here is we can actually say these are the people in SIG architecture, and then we can have the steering committee ratify that. Or what we can do is we can work cooperatively, try and get to some sort of consensus without an formal approval process, and then let the steering committee go through and approve, reject, modify that. But at least we can tee it up for the steering committee to be able to make that decision.
I feel like this is really out of bounds for the steering committee. And I know that I'm not on the committee to say that, but there was an explicit statement that they don't want to get involved in technical arbitration. So the best thing that we can do is to self-govern around creating a decision model, because we also have to use those powers, those decision-making powers around the proposals that are getting sent to us. Ergo,
yeah, so I think a healthy thing for us to do would be able to actually structure this thing in a way where we can make decisions with the understanding that if there are people in the community are very upset about the decisions that are being made by this group, they do have that chance to appeal to the steering committee in terms of, hey, this thing is out of control, right?
That is true of all SIGs.
Guardrails on that.
Yep, all SIGs have that.
Can I make a suggestion to come back to maybe Jace's practical thing? We're talking very meta here. What about the idea of just starting with, we'll write, here's the bounds of SIG architecture, here's the goals of SIG architecture. And then if when it comes to the decision making, we can wait until the last, just in time. If we have a problem where the consensus of the people here doesn't work and we need something more, then we go tackle okay, how do we implement process because this just isn't working? And then we can handle that. So it's kind of the just-in-time approach, and it gets us kind of the practical of here's the goal and here's the bounds, and then we can start. Hopefully that'll help us, start attacking diagrams and communication and how we handle the CAP process and things like that as well.
I like that idea. I don't have high confidence that we won't immediately get deadlocked on some contentious things. I think this is more than a lot of the other SIGs. This is one of those places where we're going to see things come to a head. And we're going to see people with a lot of different priorities, working against, not against each other, but a lot of priorities sort of meeting up and not meshing well, right? And that's just natural in any sort of big group of people. But I think this is one of those places where we're going to see a lot of that stuff happening. So more than any other SIG, I think we actually do need some sort of decision-making process in this SIG that we can use moving forward.
Tim, I think you unmuted for a second. I want to make sure that you have the floor if you wanted to say something.
No, I think we're going around a bit of a meta circle, and I do actually have I wanted to talk about using the CAP process and actually give feedback as to what worked and what didn't work and what I thought about it. If folks wanted to do that today.
Yeah, let me look at the agenda real quick because there is a CAP thing on there. I just want to make sure that there's not something. Okay, so I do have a tactical thing too that we absolutely need to address this meeting, which is what are we going to tell the community in an hour when we have the community meeting, because we have an update to give. And I need to have at least something to say other than, boy, we're having a great time being deadlocked. I
have a quick suggestion, which I think might help also with some of the bigger picture, which is, I'm very happy to hear that the goal is actually to get more technical decisions being made. It feels like maybe a problem is we don't have this pipeline of CAPs, whatever it is coming in.
Yep.
So if you use the floor to say here is what SIG architecture can do for you, you submit a CAP and we will review it and get it approved in a cross-SIG way. We can break those deadlocks or whatever it is that like what SIG architecture can do for me, and then you get this pipeline of KEPs or whatever you want, and you have, work.
No, I think that's great. And I would love to get to the point where we're publishing this stuff like a couple days beforehand. If people can't make the meeting, they can actually get some opinions in over email. Yep. And it can really be something where it's like, hey, this is something that the community is taking a look at. Let's all sort of laser focus on that and see if we can actually sort of, work some of this stuff out. So that is the KEP process. I'm looking at the SIG architecture charter, which the first thing it says is this is work in progress. One of the things there is what is and isn't out of scope, and then some of it is documented involving the system architecture. And I think the KEP stuff is really part of that. And of course, this links to, here's the, okay. So we can do two things at once, right? I mean, we don't have to, in terms of, does somebody want to like we have the scope of Kubernetes is that what is Kubernetes thing? It might be worthwhile for somebody to actually take a look at that through the eyes of, is that useful for this group to be able to make decisions and say this is in and this is out? And I think this is a little bit of Brian's baby. And then if we can sort of get somebody sort of looking at that, I think that's useful. And then maybe we can then start going through and talking about the KEP process.
Yeah.
No? I'm looking for a volunteer to take a look at the what is and is not Kubernetes and come to an opinion of that with respect to, is that useful to this group? Because I think it's a little bit focused on end users versus something that is more sort of architectural, technically focused for this group.
I'll jump in and say, I think there's a good reason that it is relevant to this group, because what is this group debating and who are the end users and what does this group need to architect for? So like Joe, earlier you talked about the ecosystem, right? That is a class of user, somebody who's building cloud providers, volume plugins, those kinds of things. Those are different end users. And so we need to have architecture patterns that we get folks around that enable them to be successful. And that is a class of user, but we have to define what is and what is not Kubernetes. If Kubernetes is not all those volume providers, then we need to make sure we have a clear interface. And so sure, that document is end users, but there's still more end users that aren't covered there. And we probably need to refine that picture to enable the ecosystem, as you said.
And I think this document is very much about the Kubernetes ecosystem, right? What is the Kubernetes way of approaching the world? Which is different from what is the Kubernetes project, which is going to be a subset of the larger ecosystem. And I don't think that we have a clear line in terms of what the project is versus the wider ecosystem. Yeah, all right, and so that's all very meta. I'm signed up to do everything, but like if nobody else wants to, I can actually do that and actually maybe take a stab of like how do we actually start drawing a line between the Kubernetes project and the ecosystem. I know Brian also volunteered an email thread to try to take a hack at that also, but he's unfortunately unable to join us right now.
Is it possible that you and Brian could pair on this? And I know that's
we could try. No, I think it's good. I'll put an action item for me, and I'll reach out to Brian and say, hey, like let's try and actually create something that's going to be more of a razor test. We'll call it Grant's razor.
I don't want to get into like politics too much, but like I feel that you don't want to like. You want to work in terms of like as things arise, you define your responsibilities. You don't want a constitutional document which therefore like people try to parse and slice and say like therefore this is not in our bounds, right? You want to say who else is going to decide this? We're going to decide it. We decide it.
And I think let's discuss that also. I don't want to like rat hole on that right now. I think that's a good point of discussion. Is this sort of like law, or is this a guideline and it's case law in terms of like it's an evolving thing over time, right? And I think that there's one of the things why there's humans in the loop with this is that we actually do want to have an opportunity for this group to actually sort of be realistic about what's in and what's out versus being very dogmatic about
Yeah, and to complement that, I mean, so I threw this out yesterday, an idea of a ecosystem working group to deal with those ecosystem projects, and how do you enable them, and where's the interface, and just to do that work of saying, okay, if SIG architecture is the core of the Kubernetes project, and then there's that ecosystem, what group, and it's a working group rather than a SIG is the proposal, because it actually crosses a number of SIGs to kind of bring those folks together and provide them with what they need in a clear interface, and kind of take the pressure off of here, because I know some folks in here have been feeling pressure of, well, this SIG owns everything, and there's ecosystem, and there's all of this. And the diagrams that I produced based on our conversations talked a lot about ecosystem and where that line is. So to kind of have an area that covers that as well. And I've been talking to folks, and this is kind of, I curated the ideas and the thoughts of a number of people to write that up, but it's by no means mine. And in those conversations with folks, I found that there's actually, those pictures that I drew based on our conversations here, they kind of sat well with people as far as the dividing line. They kind of like that. And I think it's worth going out and validating that with a wider audience, because that may help you, Joe, and Brian kind of come to conclusion on it, because at least that conveys it in a picture in a way people can reason very clearly, rather than, a 10-page document.
I agree with that. I think that that's good. I think the more we have an active ecosystem, the more it relieves pressure for folks to want to jam everything into the main Kubernetes project.
Yeah.
All right.
So we need to move on a little bit, because we're again in the meta layer. I think that one thing, just as my closing thoughts about this, is that we also need to be thinking about risk, and that a sloppy, roughshod Kubernetes architecture is a project risk. And so we need to be really cautious and cognizant of what role we play in that, and where we can step in to avert risk. So, there may be a high level of risk with things being put in tree that shouldn't be, or some of those things. And we need to keep our eye on that ball in some ways, more than diagrams and things that are easy for the community to digest, because there is real risk in the code right now that we're sitting on top of that could easily blow up on us, and we need to just watch for that. So,
well, and I think, Jace, this is another argument for ecosystem. Something in the ecosystem is less risky to the project as a whole.
100%.
It has a chance to bake, get users, be proven before it actually becomes something more critical.
I could not agree more. The more ecosystem, the better. The less changes in core Kubernetes, the better.
Okay.
So,
all right. So, Tim, you want to talk?
Cap.
Oh, look, you were all ready. You got your hand on the green button, man.
Yeah, I had my hand on the green button. I just had to find the mute as everything shifted around when I hit the thing. So here is the actual KEP template that exists in the main repository. So if you go, let me just back up here for a second. If you go under contributors, design proposal, architecture, and it says 00 KEP template, right? And I like looking at the raw just because then I can compare back and forth with the example. Now, right off the bat, there's this section which is like the metadata, right? And the metadata is great, and it sucks at the same time. It sucks because all of our documents are in Markdown, and we're embedding YAML in Markdown. So there's a problem here that exists when you want to put references. So if you're trying to put a Markdown reference inside of C also, basically to point to the other document, it doesn't work. So instead, what I did is I actually put I put references directly in the summary portion of my thing. Right. So the metadata section doesn't work so well because you're embedding YAML inside of Markdown.
So I think so, Tim, the thinking behind this, and I don't know whether it's sane thinking or not, was that the raw GitHub interface for this stuff is probably not good enough, and that doing some sort of specialized render with cross references and the ability to slice and dice these things in search is actually going to be the thing that's going to be most valuable. So that's one of the reasons why the metadata is there like that, is to really make it so that this thing is machine parsable and we can start building sort of information architecture tools on top of it. If there's another way to do it without throwing that away, I think that would be great.
Yeah, I don't disagree. It's a good idea. There's logistical problems that we need to tackle, right?
So
And we need to update this example to reference some of the logistical problems. So that's one of them, right?
So can I make a proposal here, just real quick on this?
Sure.
If you look at how, static site generators use Markdown and YAML all the time to do this, or other things, and they actually structure the document differently. Instead of embedding it as a snippet here, they put it first, and then the Markdown follows it. In fact, a lot of the rendering engines know how to do that as a table. Could we shift it like that? Because then you're actually separating one document has two parts, and YAML parsers know how to handle this, and there's tools already that can do this.
Well, this is like the head matter sort of idea. Yeah. I'm totally game with that. How does that render in GitHub?
It actually turns those top parts into a table and displays it. Let me see if I can find an example. I'll see if I can find an example.
Yeah, if you have a reference, that'd be highly useful. But that's
one
like one.
Keep in mind, just for folks that are writing a lot of documents, is there's this utility out there called grep, which is essentially it uses a web service at GitHub to actually do rendering of a Markdown file using the GitHub engine. And so you'll actually see exactly what it's going to look like on GitHub as you do it.
There's also the preview too. So like when you're editing these things, you can see.
Right, no, but that preview only works if you push to your repo. So it doesn't work while you're actively editing.
Yeah. That was one of the logistical things that I noticed, because if you're going to do references and you're going to link documents, you have a slight conundrum. The second thing is I like the talk a lot, to forcing people to write the talk after the initial metadata information, but the how we break down pieces here in summary and motivation, I changed the nomenclature because it seemed weird, right? Because if you look here, I have a summary section exactly like it's specified, but then there's motivation. It has guide level explanation and reference level explanation. And I've been working as a software engineer for umpteen years, and I've never seen it broken down this way as a human readable explanation. So I tried to simplify it, where I said summary, and here are my objectives, and these are my goals and my non-goals. I just tried to simplify it because just from reading it and referencing other documents that we have internally, it's the same process, right?
So that stuff was, I think that was Caleb, and he was borrowing a lot of ideas from Rust. I'm totally cool with that.
Yeah, because the nomenclature here is unlike anything I've seen, right? It's very, I don't want to use the word Byzantine, but it's weird, right? Like I've never seen this is much simpler nomenclature for defining what what are your objectives, essentially, right?
What's the difference between an objective and a goal?
The goals and non-goals are part of the objectives. It's a sub-element breakdown that I put. It's not.
Okay.
They are the same.
So
maybe rename objectives to scope.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. But right in this one, it's just motivation, right?
Yeah.
So scope or here's where things start to get fuzzy. But I think motivation is part of it, right? And scope, objectives, goals, motivation all have similar things. But I think breaking down the goals and non-goals is actually a good part of that triumvirate of words, whatever way you want to wordsmith or whip out your thesaurus on things that are similar, right? The one thing that I thought was weird is they have reference level explanation and this other part here. And I'm like, why don't we just say like, what's your actual proposal? And what are your user stories? Because it just seems weird talking about this way. The other pieces down here, I like. I debate whether or not implementation history is metadata.
So one of the things that we're struggling with this, Tim, and I don't know if you saw this, is that when Caleb came at this, he very much viewed this as a tool to be able to generate release notes that made sense, right?
Yeah.
So his take on this was, these things are actually tied to releases, and a release includes a bunch of keps. A lot of this group pushed back and said, look, sometimes we're going to have changes that actually span releases. And we're going to have keps that are sort of like under the covers and don't actually sort of like aren't going to be visible to users, right? Like I think doing the sort of the big, refactoring that's happening with API machinery, having a cap around that with a plan in terms of where things are going to go isn't going to impact a ton of users, but it'll impact the developer community in a big way. And so that might actually have been something that would have been useful with a cap. And so I think that's some of the motivation for why we want to have the implementation history. Now, figuring out sort of how to actually express that, I think, is an interesting question.
Yeah, that's true. I think you might want to have a little bit of both. Like some of the implementation history is actually in like replaces or supersedes by, right? So it's kind of tied together in a little bit. Having English explanation of implementation history is also good. But let's walk down through here. So again, I changed this part to just be proposal. And underneath the proposal, I outlined via user stories, right? Like this is going from A to B, outline the user stories. One thing that Clayton brought up, which I thought was really interesting, is not a topic in the KEP, is what are the security implications of the changes that you're making? And
So-
you could outline none if there are none, but I think that's kind of a good thing to have in a template because it forces you to think about it.
Could we generalize that out to just general risk? Because security is one layer of risk. There's also compliance. There's architectural risk associated with destabilization of other core components or additional latency added to the API. There's all sorts of crazy things that could.
Yeah, I think there are areas of risk which, unless you actually put an explicit heading there saying talk about security, people are just going to write anything they like under risk. So I would suggest that that's a high enough priority that you call it out explicitly.
It could be risk and then a subsection security. And a person could just copy the template and they could add those bits in there. My goal is to have a template that is sane, that people can just copy and paste and they fill in the bits, and every proposal has a similar feel. And when you go from one proposal A to proposal B, you're not like reinterpreting the universe to try and make sense out of it, right?
So every time I've done templates like this, there's this discussion around sort of like, should we have a heading here that's required for somebody to fill out a section versus having guidelines saying, make sure you think about X, Y, Z. And invariably over time, everybody comes in and says, oh, I want to have my section in the template because it's important to me. And then you end up with a template that's like 30 pages long. So I think monitoring, documentation, accessibility, internationalization, like all those things end up being like things that can get tacked on that are going to be important, in some cases less important than others. I do think security is an important thing, but I think we need to be a little reticent about adding too many sections. I'm totally cool with having, as part of the template, saying, make sure you are considering X, Y, and Z, and having a list of sort of like considerations that people should be thinking through. I don't think we necessarily want to have a section for every single one of those.
Yeah. I agree. I think what we're trying to accomplish is the coarse grain breakout of the tree, and there could be a bunch of branches and leaves, but we'll leave that up to the people to decide. But as long as the coarse grain feel is similar and solves the problem of the documentation so that it has a similar feel and has enough meat there for people to chew on, I think that's kind of the ultimate goal.
I agree with what Joe said. One of the worst kinds of documents to read is one which is basically a template with filler between all the headings in the template, and there's actually no content in a 30-page document. So we should do whatever we need to do to avoid that.
Yeah, well, I also came from a medical background where everything had to be documented a long time ago. So like, it's not necessarily a bad thing to force the process. Like, it's not like we're going for ISO certification, but at the same time, it's not a bad thing, right? So other thing here, there was one other piece that people called out. And again, this could be one of those things where we could have a guidelines or guide rails, was how are you testing this thing, right? So I copied the other bits that were there, which was graduation criteria and implementation history, and then I have other links referenced below. But the one thing that people asked for was, how is this being tested? How do I know that this thing that you're talking about is actually going to be something I can consume and not just some crapware that's, you know, how do I go to validate and to update that validation piece over time, right? So I don't know if we want to call that out at all explicitly.
Yeah. So one thing I think that we should make clear in this template, I'm not sure it came across, is that like, if you have a feature and you want to take it to alpha and then to beta and then to GA, is that a single KEP across that entire thing, or is it a, or do you do a separate KEP for each step in that process?
I think you're supposed, from the document and from the way it looks like this is supposed to be a living document and is meant to be revised. So that way you have the revision history recorded in the implementation history down below.
That's my thinking, is that these things are about the total arc of an effort that goes from, you know, that may go across versions. And so you can say, okay, in version, we did X, Y, and Z. In this version, we did X, Y, and Z. Yeah.
Well, so just from a purely implementation standpoint, what happens is you have the KEP, which is document and markdown. And then you have, for every release milestone, you have a series of issues that are describing the work to be completed in the milestone that chip away at the KEP. And then the PRs reference the issues. So you can actually drill down from any PR in any milestone to see exactly what KEP it ties to. So that thread, ergo, means that the KEP is a high-level multi-milestone type of document.
Yeah.
And I think that solves the big problem of the features repo too, if we force it, right? Because the features repo is this unmaintained goo, and this actually would force the live. It doesn't force unless we say that it's going to enforce. But I think that would help to enforce getting rid of the features repo and having some canonical reference of a living document that outlines what's going on with these things. Right.
Yeah, and that's all of my proposal about getting rid of the features repo is exactly that.
Yeah. So that's most of the feedback I have. I don't hope someone was keeping notes, but I can also write it up and potentially do a PR to this one to outline some of my details.
So on my to-do list was to do a PR and really sort of take another run at those instructions. How about we work together on that, Tim?
Sure. I like simplifying the nomenclature a lot because I don't like what was here. It seems like it was cribbed from some other location, like you mentioned, from and they had some breakdown there of how they want to do it, but it does not jive with other documents that are well-defined architectural instructions. Like if you read, like, Carnegie Mellon's got a whole set of books outlining how to describe software architectures. It's all about simplicity and user stories. So.
Yeah, and like I said, I think a lot of this was taken from the Rust process, which I think, you know, works well for them, but we should take inspiration there. I don't think we need to necessarily be, you know, importing it wholesale.
In general, I like most of the things. I just think it needs refinement.
Just a quick question about the deprecation of the features repo. So what are we replacing? I mean, this document in front, or an instance of this template, would tell us about a particular feature or set of features. But where does one go for, you know, I want to see what's lined up for release, whatever it is, 1.10 or whatever. How do I know what features are likely to land in 3 or 6 months' time?
That should probably be in the metadata. Right? If your metadata contains that, a parser could rip through and get from the metadata what KEPs were lined up for a release.
Okay, right? So the answer to my question is that we're going to auto-generate the features repo based on these things, is that?
No.
Well, nix the features repo entirely from the vernacular. Just we auto-generate the list. Right?
We can call it whatever we like, but it's still going to be a list of features lined up for the future with links to where there is more detail available, which is basically what the features repo is today.
That's not entirely accurate. So there is a planning portion that it precedes every release milestone, during which SIGs will determine what they will and won't commit to deliver during that particular milestone. The KEP will have the entirety of the value described, but the implementation details are going to be done at the last responsible moment, so we don't have a bunch of people working on things that aren't teed up for work. So there's a specific document that's going to be used for planning purposes and translate into issues that get specified for each milestone ahead of the milestone. So if you want to look in what's in 110, you'd go search GitHub issues, and it'd be 110 would be the milestone, and it'll give you everything you need to know. It'll say what KEP it ties back to and so forth. But
So
there won't be pre-work done at an issue level, because that's waste.
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll do a PR against this, but like one of the things to make the automation simpler will just be like, there's no milestone here, right? But yeah, because milestone generation then could be really super simple if you had it in the metadata. Did you have a link, Matt? To what you were talking about earlier?
I did. It's one of the links in there. It ends in dot markdown. If you scroll up a little. It's just above the grip links. Welcome to Jekyll.markdown. That's just a Jekyll example of a markdown file. And you can see the raw difference. If you click on raw.
It's going to be interesting to see how, like, we have quite a bit more metadata than this to see how that renders that way. But regardless, it's...
I can do and start playing with that and do a pull request to see what happens. I mean, I already created one, and it didn't render it in a table, but it rendered it in a code chunk at the top instead. And I'm going to go see whether that's totally valid. It looks the same way it does now, except it uses the formal separation.
Yeah, it looks like this may assume that you're like doing some TOML type of thing, or just some simple headery type of things. And so we have more structure in ours right now. But regardless, I don't think it's unreasonable for us to assume that most folks will be consuming the KEPs via some sort of automation, slicing and dicing type of thing. We're not good at building that stuff, but we should be. I mean, this is one of those things that's fascinating between, say, like the Node, project and like Kubernetes, is that we're all back-end engineers. So like building like a front-end web thing is like a big deal. And so, whereas like in Node, they're like, oh, I'll just build another front end. It'll take me like 2 seconds.
We actually have, okay, so coming from SIG apps, we actually have people like that. The question is always, where do we host it and who does it and those kinds of things. If we had like a CNCF place where we knew we could host things like that, it would be a lot easier to start building them.
Totally agree. Yeah, I mean, yeah. I think there is talk of having a Kubernetes cluster for hosting Kubernetes projects, and stuff like, like dashboards and such, right? Jason, I don't know if you're up on that, but I mean, this is part of the sort of like, let's try and break a bunch of the infrastructure stuff out of Google.
Yep. We've got 9 minutes left. I want to make sure that we're hitting our targets as far as stuff. I still don't know what I'm going to say in the community meeting.
I mean, what I would say, Jace, is we are actively working on coming up with a proposal process, this KEP thing. It's still very much a work in progress, and we're going to be taking some early things through it as sort of a beta test, and just sort of like make people aware so they're not surprised. Invite them if they actually want to get involved in terms of like starting to do this, to actually start coming to this meeting. I think... and then also say that, like, there's more meta issues where SIG architecture is going to be partnering with the steering committee around, how do we sort of answer the more sort of like existential questions around the project. We don't have anything sort of concrete to report right now, but that's also within scope of this SIG. I think right now it's just a lot of like, what the hell does SIG architecture do? Is probably going to be, that's a worthwhile update for people.
Agreed.
It's a worthwhile update for us to figure out too.
Yeah, that's why I wanted. I mean, I have my own ideas, but I'm the mouthpiece, not the actual thing creating the sound.
You have agency. You can have opinions.
I do. I'm careful about when I share them. Cool.
Does
Okay.
anybody disagree with that? I think, does that any other stuff in an update that you all think should be that's missing here? That's a subset of the charter. It's the stuff that we're concentrating on right now, I think.
Sounds good.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. All right. Tim, thank you so much for going through that process with the KEP. That is real world work getting us forward. So that is super useful. Thank you. Okay. So, Joe, you've got it to do. Is there anybody else that's committing to work before the next full meeting?
What is my to-do? Let me find it.
You're going to one-on-one with Brian about
Yeah.
hashing
Okay.
out that stuff.
I'll
And then
PR
we're
the
gonna work on evolving the template.
I'll
Yeah,
PR
I'm
the
happy
main
to-
template.
Okay, cool. Great. Awesome. So real quick, in terms of the office hours, is that something that we should keep rolling forward, or is that sort of just becoming a distraction?
I think right now with the amount of stuff that we need to do, and I think it would be useful for this group to meet every week. I think making one of those meetings be a working session where we actually go through and do like what we did with Tim would be super useful. I know nothing focuses my attention more than like actually being live in a meeting working on something. Otherwise, it's so easy for other stuff to actually sort of, distract. So maybe instead of working group, we call it a working session. I mean, instead of office hours, we call it a working session.
Okay.
I
Anybody
don't know how others
disagree?
feel about that.
Anybody disagree with that?
I think the intention behind office hours was, one of the purposes of the SIG is to mediate between SIGs and resolve things that can't get resolved in the SIGs easily. And so I believe the office hours was there so that we could be available at a pre-advertised time to address those things in person where necessary. I think it would be totally reasonable to have a booking sheet of some sort, and people who wanted to come and talk to SIG architecture could book on that sheet. And if there was nothing on that sheet, we would meet anyway and discuss whatever else we needed to do. But I don't think we should get rid of the opportunity for SIGs to have a well-defined way of interfacing with us in person.
And maybe that's something else to bring up in the community meeting, Jace, is that we want to be a meeting point for SIGs that have tough problems that they're trying to actually work through, questions about how best to actually sort of render this idea into the Kubernetes world. Is definitely something that we're here for. So maybe I like the idea of actually having it be dual purpose. If we don't have an agenda, then we assume it's going to be a working session as we work through some of our.
Okay.
I was just going to say that SIG Apps does this dual purpose alternating weeks. And when we don't have, that other purpose, we fill it in with discussion, and that works really well for us.
So what I'm going to say, and I'm going to posit this to the group here, is that if we do working group type of thing, or working meeting on the alternate weeks, I would like to be a relatively iron-fisted facilitator for that. And if people start wandering off into the weeds, or we start having bike shedding type stuff, I'm going to cut it off at the knees. But I want to have that explicit facilitation power from the group. So.
As somebody who takes things off tracks, take me out at the knees, please. I'm okay with it.
Okay.
You need an air horn, Jace.
I'll get one. All right. Okay. So right now, as it stands, the plan is to offer the services of arbitration and input on initiatives at the SIG level. Barring that, we will have very focused working sessions on specific deliverables that we will complete during the time box that we have.
That sounds good. And I'm hoping that need for arbitration in sort of office hours will be reduced over time as the KEP process gets going and we actually get more clarity beforehand instead of actually waiting for the last possible minute for everybody to be surprised.
So can I tee something up for the working group session or for the working session next week if we've got time?
We do not have time because we have 3 minutes, and so I would say is put it into the agenda for the working session and the notes, and we'll go over it asynchronously, if that's okay.
That sounds great. I was actually going to pull one of our issues out. Sounds good.
I'm already breaking out the air horn. All right, everybody. Well, with that, I sincerely appreciate everybody being constructive about this because, like Joe said, this can be contentious, and it's our duty to try and serve the community as best as we can without infighting. So thank you, everyone, for that. And I will see you in a week.
Thank you, Jace.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.